the shit is my hat? Oh, right. Right. Okay. How is everyone? I'll just wait for one or two people to log on. Mm. Hope the day is treating you well. Okay. Well, let's get started then. So, excuse me. Happy Monday. Oh, excuse me. Happy Monday, everyone. Um, I'm feeling a little bit under the weather today, so diabetes has been kicking my ass a bit lately. So I figured I would do something relatively easy for myself, and hopefully something that'll be interesting to those of you who are uh, interested in sort of future risk questions or neuroscience or uh, public health or cybersecurity, which is talk a bit about my research, my academic research into a phenomenon, a hopefully so far hypothetical phenomenon that I have termed brainjacking. Now, this presentation I'll kind of run through the presentation roughly, expanding on a few bits, maybe skipping over a few bits. This presentation is one that I've given a few times before, although not for a short while, um, because I have, well, I've been out of active academic work for a little while due to health stuff, but hopefully I'll kind of get back involved in this topic and start writing some more stuff soon. Oh, sorry, just a sec. Cat being a nuisance. Right. Okay, as I was saying, this presentation is on brainjacking. So, what is brainjacking? First, I guess, is a good, quick thing to explain. Brainjacking is the process of engaging in a cyber attack on a neurological implant, a implanted medical device that interfaces with the brain for the purposes of causing some kind of trouble. So this is, like I say, currently a hypothetical risk. I have no reason to believe that anyone has been brainjacked, but I think for reasons I'll get into soon, I think it's a risk worth seriously considering because, well, yeah, like I say, I'll explain. So, bit of background first for those who aren't familiar with the field. Uh, Implantable medical devices have, for quite some time now, been identified as being potential security risks. So, perhaps the most salient example of this is in 2007 when then Vice President Dick Cheney had a had the wireless functions on his implantable cardioverter defibrillator um, altered. Now, this is basically a heart implant that keeps your heart going if it fails, and if the implant is used incorrectly, then it can potentially cause arrhythmias or fail to stop a improper heart rhythm and can cause potentially lethal side effects. Now, Dick Cheney was, for various reasons, not particularly liked at the time, and even if he was a well-liked, if he were a well-liked vice president, it's probably sensible from a security perspective to not have a very readily open attack surface to target one of the most senior members of the world's most powerful government. So, in collaboration with his doctor, he switched the wireless functions off, which does reduce its utility somewhat, though not as much back in 2007 when these devices were simpler, uh, and thereby remove the risk of his being, murdered by anyone with a laptop and a Pringles can antenna, which incidentally could potentially be used to make these kind of attacks. It's been demonstrated against insulin pumps. So Jay Radcliffe, who is himself a diabetic and a hacker, has demonstrated the ability to wirelessly control an insulin pump and thereby deliver a lethal dose of insulin to, well, obviously the pump he was trying it on wasn't implanted in anyone, but had it been implanted in someone, it would have been a potentially lethal dose. Now, I don't myself have a insulin pump. I would like to get one at some point. Indeed, I'd like to hack it so that I can have a closed loop system. The closed loop system. Right, so I've got this thing in my arm that I've shown you a couple of times before. Well, if you're new here, here is my arm thing. It consists of a sensor here with a little electrode that goes into my arm, um, chemical based electrode, and I can either, well, without this thing on top of it, I can scan using this little device, and it tells me my sensor is ending soon. It also tells me I'm at 8.6 and going up, so that's not great, but we'll ignore that for the time being. Um, this little device on top of it, however, is an aftermarket accessory that essentially functions like the dedicated scanner does, and repeatedly polls the sensor implant requesting the current blood glucose level once every 5 minutes, and then it sends it to my phone, which records these, plots out a graph, and will send me alerts if it goes low. So it's certainly not inconceivable that someone could get access either to the wireless aftermarket device on top of the implant or the implant itself in my arm, and could, for example, send messages to my phone, send data to my phone, indicating that my blood glucose was going up and up and up, which would cause me to inject insulin, going, oh shit, my blood glucose is at 12 or whatever, I better, take a good few units to bring it back down. And if my actual blood glucose were at 5, taking that amount of insulin would be very, very dangerous for me, possibly leading to coma, potentially death. Death reasonably unlikely, but it's not outside the realm of possibility, particularly if I were dropping, if my blood glucose were dropping anyway. So this is something that I've been diagnosed with in the last couple of years after I started this research back in 2015, 2016. But it kind of adds an extra layer of personal involvement for why I want to make sure that medical devices generally are made secure. MedSec in 2016, which is so Barnaby Jack is unfortunately now dead, but he demonstrated a similar thing with a pacemaker 2012 at the Black Hat conference. MedSec, this was a particularly interesting case. So they are a medical security research firm, and it was is it Johnson Johnson? No, St Jude, St Jude Medical, um, uh, like cardiac monitoring device. So kind of equivalent to how my phone is behaving. It would a dedicated device for it. It would wirelessly communicate with the cardiac implant and deliver medical data over the internet to the doctors or to the manufacturer in order to provide telemetry data. And it seems that the whole system can potentially be hacked. But it's particularly interesting because the way that MedSec tried to get paid for this was by short selling the stock of the company that manufactures these items, which isn't necessarily the most ethical way of making a cyber security threat disclosure. So that resulted in a lawsuit, I think, and I don't know how that's gone. Um, but perhaps the most relevant paper, which I'd recommend having a look at if you're interested in this kind of stuff, is Marin et al. 2018, Securing Wireless Neurostimulators, by Marin, Singoli, Yang, Volsky, and Vardenbosch. Oh, and Nutin and Preneel. And yeah, essentially they do a wireless attack on a neurostimulator, the kind of devices that I'm talking about here, and demonstrate pretty convincingly that these attacks are feasible. And it's not like this was any major breakthrough, because the devices in both cases use basically the same communications protocols. If you're Medtronic or someone and you're designing a cardiac implant and you already have the designs for a neurostimulation implant that you want to do pretty much the same thing, it's just the stimulation pattern's different and how many electrodes you have are different, then you pretty much just reuse the same design, not least because the FDA has already okayed the existing design, so it goes through smoother, which all makes sense, and every industry does that. But it also means that proof of concept in one area is, as Marin and colleagues demonstrated, it can be fairly easily translated to other devices engaged in different areas. So let's move on to the next one. So this is the main thing that my lab does. Like I say, I'm kind of on medical leave, but I at least like to still think of them as my lab. Um, but yeah, deep brain stimulation. So you can see here, excuse me, these are electrodes put into the brain um, via this system here. This is called a stereotactic frame. It's a metal frame that you can move across a guide wire, and it allows you to work out three-dimensionally the coordinate in the brain that you want to target, so a structure like deep inside your head, and then a path you want to take. So you want to take a straight path between the skull and the point that you're trying to insert an electrode to, the target you're trying to hit, without hitting any blood vessels or other major structures along the way. So you use preoperative imaging, you know, X-rays, MRIs, CT, to develop the three-dimensional image of the skull, of the head. Then you use computer software to plan the trajectory. I say you, the neurosurgeons. And then you plug in these coordinates in the stereotactic frame, which is quite satisfying. It's obviously all really nicely engineered, so very smooth movements and everything. And then drill a little hole in the skull. I mean, really quite small one as far as holes in the skull go. Um, and just plunge the electrode in slowly and smoothly, carefully. And then typically midway through, you'll, depending on the target you're hitting and the conditioning you're doing, you'll often wake up the patient midway through the operation and go through a series of behavioral tests to see how effective the stimulation is. And exactly where you're placing the electrodes varies by condition and what you're trying to do, but this can have enormously positive effects. So just to show you quickly, these aren't patients from the lab I work at, but they're pretty good demonstrations of um, well, tremor is the most obvious symptom of Parkinson's, the most commonly known symptom of Parkinson's, perhaps. But the much more prominent one for most patients in reality, at least the much more distressing one, is akinesia and bradykinesia. So this is the inability to adequately initiate movements. And you can see with this patient here that he's got the stereotypical fascinating gait. So I'll just go back and go over that a bit. So wide stance, and each step is almost kind of falling forward a bit. Uh, it's very sort of juddery, very slow. He's having to concentrate hard on moving his feet, and now we get to turning. He is having real difficulty switching into that next movement. So going from a walking gait to rotation, it's quite a different set of muscles that are being used, and crucially, a different muscle program. So I won't go too much into how motor actions are selected in the brain, but part of the issue with Parkinson's is you've got a disruption of the ability to select the correct motor program. So this is the correct like cascade of controls of signals that needs to be sent out anytime you engage in an action. Because everything I do, every time I wave my hand around, this is coordinating dozens of muscles in a very precise way. I'm coordinating dozens here, in a very precise way, with the right timing and the right spatial organization to give rise to these complex movements. And I'm not, really thinking about it. I'm not thinking, okay, I need to tense this muscle now and relax this one. I'm just thinking, wiggle my fingers. Um, so in Parkinson's, I've gone past, I've been nattering on. In Parkinson's, initiating those movements, selecting the right one from all of the possible programs that you could be running is a real problem, and this leads to things like problems with turning, problems with gait. Um, so this patient currently has his stimulator turned off. This is an implanted device just below the skin, probably of the clavicle. Sometimes it's on the hip, um, but this is the patient with the stimulator on. Same patient, almost certainly same day, uh, quite possibly literally a minute or two later, because the change is that rapid. And this is a pretty good treatment response, but it's not like unusually amazing. Obviously, he's on the younger side. Sometimes younger people respond a bit better. As far as Parkinson's patients go, it's a disease of aging, so it tends to be older patients. Um, but just that little electrical jolt going from the pacemaker-like implant up through those wires that I pointed out. So the implant's down here, up through these wires, and down into the brain, where you can see these little kind of line striations on the points here. These are the different electrode contacts, and each of those can be stimulating, and they thereby modulate the electrical activity deep in the brain, which alters whole behavior. So this is pretty wonderful. It's an absolutely fascinating treatment. Obviously, I am biased, but uh, it's tremendously useful for patients. And while I'm just talking about Parkinson's here, it can be extremely effective in a whole range of conditions. So, essential tremor, people with a constant tremor. I won't show you another video, but it can go from tremor like that to completely still. I've seen that happen in the theatre. You have a patient holding their hand up and they're moving it around, possibly even like whole shaking like that, and the treatment goes on, and they go, maybe there's a slight tremor, but it's absolutely remarkable. And then dystonia, this is one of the more common treatment among younger people. Dystonia involves very unpleasant contractions of the muscles. So often they'll be kind of like all tensed up like that, and it's not just that they can't unclench the muscles, but they get damage to ligaments, chronic pain, twisting of skeletal structure, all very unpleasant side effects. And the longer this goes on, the worse it can be. Fortunately, deep brain stimulation for some patients, obviously, you check with your doctor. I'm not a physician, etc., etc. But for some patients, uh, can be extremely effective at relieving this and giving kids and teenagers like a normal lease on life with an implant that they're not cheap, but they're coming down in price for the whole system. Costs are difficult because you've got to like work it out over time with like battery replacements and so on and so forth. Um, but that kind of brings me on to, but my point is it's not ludicrously expensive by the standards of medical treatments. But talking about the battery brings me on to the actual hardware. So do I have? Oh, you can see it better here. I've got a few of these neurostimulators, but uh, you can see it here. This is the actual implant itself, the device that goes beneath the skin, and most of it is taken up with a battery. You've got a typically lithium-ion battery in there, though the the oldest ones, not neurostimulators, but um, uh, cardiac implants. The oldest ones, some of them were powered by radioisotope generators, so you'd have a tiny little bit of plutonium in there that's generating like thermally generating current. I mean, it's perfectly safe for the user because they're in a metal can inside the body, but pulling them out of patients, again, not that I've done this, I'm not a doctor, uh, but where the surgeon's pulling them out of patients, occasionally still you'll get someone who had one implanted as a kid in the 1960s or whatever, and pull it out and go, oh shit, plutonium, radioactive warning symbol. Doesn't happen much anymore, but it's still a still a risk. Um, so if you do happen across one of these, just leave it alone. Call someone. It's probably fine, but don't go drilling into it. don't do that. That's very bad. Um, so yeah. Anyway, modern ones are mostly lithium-ion cells, and you can see in the X-ray here, basically all of that bit is a big battery. But then you've also got an antenna in there, so sending and receiving signals, because it not only needs to be able to take data for programming in the pattern of stimulation, also needs to be able to send data about device diagnostics and the impedance encountered, so the electrical characteristics of the electrode contacts and how they're interfacing with nervous tissue. Um, and then you've also got a microprocessor, obviously for storing you have memory for storing the data and for controlling the pattern of stimulation, all these kind of things. So internally, they're not hugely complex currently, but they are increasing in complexity. So if I okay, so currently, or at least up until recently, the default way of controlling these was with devices much like my little shitty diabetes scanner thing here. I say it's shitty. This device is a bit shitty. The actual implant is very cool. But this device is designed by a medical tech company, not Apple or continuously going up. Not Apple or Samsung or anyone. So, it's not a cool flash piece of consumer hardware. It's just like the kind of minimum viable product. Although, admittedly, the Abbott Freestyle ones are somewhat better than a lot of the other ones. The AccuCheck ones are shit. Um, but I don't work for Abbott, though one of my friends does. Hi, Ben. Um, but yeah, it, going back to the actual topic at hand, somewhat like these devices is the patient programmer. So you got the implant here, wherever, but under the skin somewhere. You hold the patient programmer up to it, and it'll sync with the between the programmer and the implant, and you can tap away to change settings. So this is one of the old patient programmers. This is one of the old clinician programmers. So it's the advanced version that the doctors have access to, and the specialist nurses and so forth, and occasionally me when I'm playing around with old implants that aren't in patients anymore. And you can use it to interface with the device and control more settings, go higher and lower on the stimulation settings and so forth. But the crucial thing here is that the modern implants, the ones coming out now and coming out for the last few years, are increasingly being controlled not by uh, old school devices like that, but by smartphones or tablets. So typically, when you get one of these, it'll come with either a smartphone or uh, one of the iPod touches. So it's got Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, but not cellular access. Something along those lines is pretty common, and increasingly it's going in the direction of not coming with a dedicated device, but you download an app and onto any Android or Apple phone, and as long as you've got a phone with Bluetooth, yeah, you connect to your implant fine. And I've got to say, as someone who uses an open source app for for controlling my implant and for measuring it, it's great. Very convenient. Um, and it's kind of inevitable that that's the direction it's going in, because it requires so much less training, both of the clinicians who are already used to using iPads and iPhones in medical treatment, and the patients who, particularly, you know 10-20 years ago, Parkinson's patients generally quite difficult to train on this kind of stuff, but increasingly, we see people in their 50s, 60s, 70s who are perfectly competent with tech, and a lot of them will have access to an iPad that they use for FaceTime, or their iPhone that maybe they don't use as quite as competently as shit, my bloody headphones. Anyway, not maybe not used quite as competently as a Zoomer or Millennial, but still able to conversant with the basic kind of semiotic structure of apps. So that's wonderful. It reduces costs, obviously, even though these things look really janky because of economies of scale and the specialist design needed, they cost considerably more than your equivalent, consumer electronic device. And it's more and more becoming the case as these implants are more software defined than hardware defined. The implants can get updates over the air, so even a relatively old implant, a lot of them have an expected lifespan in the decades, particularly the new rechargeable ones, because the old ones just had they don't use much power, so the old ones just lasted for ages, but were a bit bulkier and a bit crap. But with the new rechargeable ones, they're lasting decades. Um, so you need to be able to update them, update their software. Uh, so all of this is wonderful in many ways. Updated software means you can patch security holes that are identified. It means you can improve features. It also means you can implement all kinds of DRM stuff that we might not be able to, we might not want. But in terms of patient care, this is great. Um, Problem is that each of these, if you're in cybersecurity or even have a basic familiarity with cybersecurity, you've probably seen where I'm going with this. That consumer grade devices are pretty open to attacks. There are many demonstrated attacks that one can use on all the generations of Bluetooth, which obviously an older implant is likely to have. Um, on any old Android or iPhone, particularly via the App Store, and particularly if we are, as I mentioned earlier, transmitting from an iPhone that you just keep for communicating with your device onto your iPhone, your Android, um, then we get the gambling app that your kid accidentally downloaded, or the predatory tower defense game that has a bunch of crapware on it, or that email link you clicked that has malware. Any of these plausible attacks can start interfering, deliberately or not, with a vital piece of medical equipment. And if that's a cardiac device, then potentially pretty worrying because you might die. Similarly, if it's an insulin pump, these are, uh, if they go seriously wrong, there's a decent chance of the results being lethal, or at least requiring a hospital stay. But in the case of neurological implants, the implications are, to my mind, far more interesting and potentially far more concerning in the long run. Um, so, assuming you have access to somebody's implant and you mean to do them harm, uh, what could you do? So this actually, I was having a conversation earlier with Gregory Lewis, who's a fascinating researcher working at the Future of Humanity Institute, and I will hopefully be having him the on the stream sometime soon. But we were talking about global catastrophic biological risks, and I did bring up this work I've done because this is the categorization of potential attacks here was the core piece of my 2016 paper in World Neurosurgery about this, the paper that coined brainjacking. And I'm now I'm now less confident that I was sensible in in publishing the specifics of these kind of attacks. Um, I did address the risk of information hazards briefly in the paper, and I think given how simple these attacks are and how rudimentary neurological implants are currently, I don't think it's too bad. I don't think I've meaningfully increased risk, but part of my kind of argument here, part of my core concern is that uh, that as we go forward, as these devices become more complex, we'll see more and more attacks that can be undertaken. And I think as that happens, it's going to be and more sophisticated and more practical attacks. And I think as that happens, it's going to be increasingly important for me to kind of shut my mouth and at least about the kind of stuff I'm talking about in this paper, um, because I don't want to give people bad ideas. Um, and you might say, that there's not much risk of that. How many people who want to engage in mind control want they're currently watching Twitch, which I'd say fair enough. Uh, but my paper here, it's is it my best cited paper? It's moderately well cited for an early career researcher sort of thing, if I do say so myself, and it got some international media attention. And while I doubt that it's given many people ideas, there is a non-zero possibility that it's given some potentially concerning ideas for things to look into on the part of, say, state intelligence actors. And this kind of thing wouldn't be without precedent because in the early 2000s, Al Qaeda started looking into options for bioterror attacks, specifically because one of the reasons they cited, I think it was found in the material from the Bin Laden raid, but one of the key reasons that was given internally for seeking out potential bioterror attack options was that the US security community was so concerned, justifiably so, about a bioterror attack. So, both in terms of general worries and specific information, there is a good case for at least being very cautious about the kind of information one puts out. That said, since I've already published this and the damage has been done, it would be kind of mean for me not to tell you. So I categorized this into blind attacks and planned targeted attacks. That's how I categorized it. I forget my homework. Um, so the distinction here is that blind attacks can be conducted using no previously required information without any like meaningful research into the patient's condition. And targeted attacks are ones that require more setup, but potentially can have, I think, more interesting results. So blind attacks can be used as a setup to targeted attacks, um, but and two could potentially be conducted in combination. Um, but blind attacks have been like relatively well characterized in terms of the literature on like cardiac implants and so forth. Basically, if you're stimulating the body with electricity, you can you can do these to some degree at least. So denying therapy, you can just switch off the implant in order to stop the stimulation, which if you've got Parkinson's and you do that at the wrong moment could potentially be dangerous. Indeed, if you do it in Parkinson's and there's a rebound effect, which is very common, which is when you switch off stimulation, the symptoms get worse even than they would be at baseline. You can get patients. Remember, I showed you earlier the freezing of gait. Um, in this patient, this is with therapy off. He gets to selecting action. He almost can't move. He's just standing there. Imagine if you're driving and you get an effect like that to an even greater degree. That's not something we want, and currently is pretty safe for people with Parkinson's to, again, check with your doctor, people with Parkinson's to drive using these implants. But if I pull up alongside someone driving and, with the aforementioned Pringle can antenna, hack into their implant and switch it off, it's a relatively simple attack, but could cause a car crash. Now, obviously, that's pretty minor. Sorry, not minor. That's pretty bad if it does occur, but is pretty low risk in terms of you'd have to be driving alongside someone and so forth. But battery drain is potentially even worse though, because if you repeatedly, this is arguably the easiest attack to do, if you repeatedly just interrogate the implant, by which I mean you send it the kind of wake up signal to say it needs to be communicating with another device. You don't even need any kind of authentication keys or anything to do that, but it'll drain the battery a bit and drain it reasonably large amount compared to the kind of default background stimulation going on. And if you do that over and over, the battery wears out, and if it goes too low multiple times, even with a rechargeable implant, that can necessitate taking it out and replacing it, which exposes the patient to surgical risks and all of the stress of going through another surgery. So obviously we don't want that. Tissue damage. This is a graph showing the amount of charge distributed per cycle. There's the charge density, and above a certain threshold with deep brain stimulation, like implants in a tissue sample, there's substantial tissue damage, which is obviously unsurprising given you put enough electricity into organic tissue and it's going to cause some damage. Um, Normally, neurostimulators are set up in such a way that they don't do this. I mentioned earlier with the physician controller versus the patient controller. The physician controller has access to other additional settings, including some that could be potentially dangerous. Um, but if we hack the implant, potentially it can go higher and cause all kinds of unpleasant tissue damage, which is very much dependent on the site of stimulation. Then you've got side channel attacks. So this just involves listening to the implant essentially and using uh, uh, data transmissions that the designers didn't expect to leak out to gain access to information on the implant. And considering the implants often store information about the patient's doctor, the patient's name, the patient's date of birth, the patient's condition, potentially records from previous sessions, and increasingly physiological data recorded from the patient, as well as stimulating the more modern implants can record as well. All of this could be used to set up, could be used generally to breach privacy and cause all kinds of concerning things. For example, if we've got a, government leader or a business person or whatever with one of these implants, someone accesses it and just gets out the information about their condition, that could be used for blackmail or crashing a stock price or whatever. Um, like I say, just to reiterate, so that anyone recently joining doesn't get me wrong here, I don't think that this is a high probability occurrence at the moment. My purpose in raising this, which I did a few years ago now, and I'm glad to see some companies seem to be taking security quite seriously, uh, but I think it's still a substantial emerging issue, at least for people in the field to be talking about. Um, my purpose for raising this is that I think in the future, this is potentially going to be a big concern. Um, so actually, we'll just intersperse this quickly with, before we get on to targeted attacks, with one of my um, influences, and I think a pretty decent fictional portrayal of a neurological implant hack. Um, to, Ghost in the Shell and Neuromancer, I both cited in my original paper on this. Oh wait, this is not outputting.
A hacker called the Puppet Master has
Right,
begun
there
to
we go.
infiltrate terminals throughout our network. We believe it's extremely likely that he'll target the secret talks that are scheduled with the Republic of Gavel. As a precaution, we put everyone attending the talks under surveillance. It's my suspicion that once he hacked into her ghost, he'd use her to assassinate the key delegates.
So how much time do we have before this hacker breaks through her barrier program and reaches her ghost?
Roughly 2 hours. He's using an old-fashioned HA3 virus. After that, we'll have to break the connection to avoid any
2 hours is pretty good time for a
Alpha
firewall
and
to stand up.
Ishikawa are tracking the signal source from their car. Contact them.
So in the Ghost in the Shell world, first of all, ghost is kind of used to mean like soul, spirit, mind, something in that sort of area, consciousness perhaps. Um, One thing to note is that they discover this hack via surveillance of cyberbrains. Now, real cyberbrains, real neurological implants don't look very much like this. They're not an organic brain all encased in, ceramic composite, or at least they won't be for quite some time. Um, but the possibility of widespread neurological implantation and non-implanted devices as well, so external brain-computer interfaces or minimally invasive implantable devices like the Neuralink system that Elon Musk is championing. Um, all of these things are likely to become prevalent at some point in the future and probably over the coming decades. And if we don't develop good firewalls that can keep out hackers for 2 hours, even super class A hackers like Laughing Man or whatnot, then we're going to be in trouble. And in the Ghost in the Shell world, it seems you'll notice they talked about surveilling members of the ambassador's delegation or whatnot to identify the hacker's attack. uh, it may be the case that governments want to surveil our implants, and that some of the risk here will not just come from individual bad actors, but from whole nation states potentially trying to avert some of the risk that I'm talking about. So going back, that was a I would categorize that as sort of an information theft side channel um, type attack, or a blind attack at least. Uh, but yeah, moving back to reality, or at least closer to plausible reality. Um, in the paper, I also identified some targeted attacks that could take place. So if you do want to, just a sec. So if you do want to look into the actual, um, just like I keep on finding, where's the actual? It's nice to see a few people have cited me. That's good. There's the actual paper. So if you are interested in looking into the actual like physiological basis to the attacks that I'm talking about, I won't go too much into them too much here. But okay, for the record, I wrote basically all of this paper. Won't get into the politics of academic publishing, but I'm flattered that so many people wanted to be on the paper because, like I said, basically my baby. Um, but yeah, if you're interested, Pycroft et al. 2016, World Neurosurgery, Brainjacking, Implant Security Issues, and Invasive Neuromodulation. Looking back, I probably could have given it a catchier title, but sometimes you want one of those, I've got the catchy word neologism here, and then the sensible, serious sounding bit here to make sure you know that my cool, catchy word isn't too unserious. Um, but yeah, if you want to look into the actual kind of physiological basis behind this, all of these attacks were. I was basically trying to do. Yeah, thank you. I was basically trying to do some kind of threat modeling based on what currently exists in medical practice, and limited to assuming an attacker does have control over the implants to a comparable degree, uh, that a clinician would, um, what could be done to interfere with patients using the things we already know um, about neurophysiology and deep brain stimulation. And my idea was to kind of provide a sort of minimum viable product of, here's the right now current, we definitely could do, uh, definitely could happen, sort of things to be worried about, um, to illustrate the potential that comes with far more intricate implants and far more widespread implants, and crucially, as I mentioned above or earlier, the integration of these devices with our consumer electronics and with the wider networked world. So, I was mentioning with Parkinson's earlier, the the typical stimulator for Parkinson's, at least of the subthalamic nucleus, is sending signals at 130 hertz, 130 cycles per second of electrical activity. And this seems to interfere with oscillations, with neural cycles of electrical activity that are going on in the like 25 to 30 hertz range. However, while 130 hertz is therapeutic, or they're about 100 plus hertz, high frequency, uh, going it down to 10 hertz or so has the opposite effect. It kind of like the on-off effect I was mentioning earlier with cessation of stimulation, seems to do that, but potentially even worse, causing people with Parkinson's, at least in some cases, to basically entirely freeze up. And if you thought removing someone's stimulation while they're driving was bad, wait till you see sort of switching off a lot of their motor control. I don't want to say switching off is kind of, there's a lot of talk in brain stimulation about switching things on and off, and it's a convenient metaphor and one that can be quite compelling, but I try to avoid it because it's not a switch. It's complex oscillatory circuits that behave in distinct ways to a light switch. It's just that sometimes the effects are so rapid that it's easy to, I don't say anthropomorphize. What's the sort of oversimplify and mentally map it as, oh, you just press a button and their brain works again. Brilliant. Um, but obviously it's somewhat more complex than that. Um, so motor impairment, one could do in patients with chronic pain disorders. Some patients are treated for chronic pain with deep brain stimulation. Unfortunately, not as many as should be. Arguably, this is scientifically controversial, and I'm very much biased by the lab I work in. But the results I've seen and the data I've seen suggest to me that we should be doing much more deep brain stimulation for treatment of chronic pain, at least severe chronic pain disorders, some of which are a vastly under-recognized problem. Some patients end up literally killing themselves over the constant life-wrenching pain they're in, and work by my lab indicates, or my supervisor's lab, again, I'm not a surgeon, uh, indicates that these patients can receive massive relief partially bitter over this because my original doctoral project was going to be looking at some really interesting like neuropsychology, kind of neuropsychological effects of this research, this stimulation in pain patients. But unfortunately, the budgets got slashed, and our unit wasn't able to do the surgeries anymore because the surgery is quite expensive, even though we would argue they're very much cost effective in terms of the amount of relief offered. But I digress. The point here is that by stimulating this area to relieve pain, we also open up the risk of a cyber attacker changing the pattern of stimulation, analogous to the motor impairment example, and thereby enhancing pain, or exacerbating pain, I should say. Um, Impulse control and emotion are particularly interesting ones. These are dealt with by, well, very widespread parts of the brain, but some of the regions involved in treating Parkinson's and motor disorders are also involved in aspects of uh, regulating emotional behavior and control over impulses. So I was talking earlier about Parkinson's being partially a kind of disease of action selection. So the inability to adequately choose one motor program, one series of actions from all the possibilities. However, stimulating in the wrong place, using the wrong electrode contacts, or just stimulating in the wrong direction, as it were, to the wrong frequency, can modify circuits that are involved in all of these functions, and can potentially, well, in some patients, off-target effects, so unintended effects of stimulation that one could artificially induce if one were so inclined, can lead to extreme emotional lability. So this is patients getting very, very upset over absolutely nothing, and then suddenly becoming fine again, and then suddenly getting this like very, very extreme mood swings. And in some cases, things like hypersexuality, pathological gambling. This is particularly the kind of well, both the reward learning and impulse control disorders. So this is sometimes observed in Parkinson's patients taking too high a dose of dopamine stimulating medication, or producing, releasing L-DOPA. So L-DOPA is the main pharmaceutical treatment of Parkinson's, and there's some other drugs that enhance the way L-DOPA is uptaken and reduces off-target effects and so forth. But the point is that modulating dopamine in the brain can help treat Parkinson's, but it can also induce impulse control disorders. So think the stereotypical person high on cocaine, their brains flooded with dopamine. I'm being slightly reductionist here, but and they tend to engage in more risky behavior, more risk reward sort of seeking behavior. And this can manifest in very unwise decision making, signing bad contracts, and sometimes in things like sexually aggressive behavior. Uh, and these can be, in rare cases, be induced as well as by medication by deep brain stimulation. And while this is kind of physiologically unsurprising because all of these systems do overlapping things, or are anatomically close to systems that do overlapping things, but nevertheless, it's something that it's a set of side effects that we should be wary of, and that clinicians need to be wary of. Now, in normal clinical practice, this is fine because it's not fine, it can have very devastating effects, but in normal clinical practice, one optimizes stimulation parameters such that they don't cause, aggressive sexuality or gambling away one's life savings. But an attacker who, particularly an attacker who had access to the physiological data that is being recorded by an implant, could entirely plausibly um, induce these behaviors deliberately. Now, just to be clear, I'm not talking about the attacker goes, haha, okay, I want to make this person gamble their life savings away. So I'm going to specifically stimulate X region of the brain in Y manner so that they become an inveterate gambler. That's not currently close to plausible. What I am saying is that an attacker who had reasonably sophisticated knowledge of the patient's specific condition could make an educated guess about what stimulating in a different manner might induce, and could potentially use so rather than saying I want to make them a gambler, they might say, okay, I want to increase the kind of risky behavior this person engages in, um, and they could potentially induce, or they could potentially utilize a kind of empirical method to mess with someone's behavior over a longer period of time. So if you had constant control over this implant, then the attacker could change certain parameters up and down. They could change the electrode being used and monitor the person, monitor the target, the patient, over an extended period of time to see what parameters did what. Now, this would be some fairly like supervillain level fuckery, but on the other hand, 4chan makes not infrequent attacks on uh, epileptic people's Twitter and forums for epileptic people, trying to, you know, spam them with flashing images. And 4chan also occasionally spends thousands of man hours tracking down the location of Shia LaBeouf or any of the other absurd things that a bunch of nerds with far too much time and too much malice can do. So I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility that if they found I say they generally like the underbelly of the internet, um, with a few STEM majors who have access to the basic physiological knowledge here, a couple of computer science majors who understand the or electrical engineering or whatever majors who understand the tech well enough, and they have enough time on their hands, then if you've got constant or the ability to surveil someone over a long period of time, say, I don't know if they do regular Twitch streams, then it's not at all implausible. Uh, and then we come to my favorite attack, or at least the one that is kind of most out there, but uh, still plausible, is good old rats of Olds and Milner. So this rat has a wire going into the septal region of its brain, and it's got a little lever here, and every time it presses the lever, it gets a tiny little electrical jolt into this brain region. Now, this region of the brain is equivalent to the nucleus accumbens and some related structures in the human brain, and it's commonly known, but incorrectly known, as the pleasure center. It's more accurately known, I would say, as the wanting center, or the kind of reinforcement center, though even that does simplify things a bit much. The important lesson here is that by stimulating this part of the brain, one can induce reward-based learning. It's kind of releases a direct reward signal in a vaguely analogous manner, or fairly directly comparable manner to some addictive drugs. Say, going back to our cocaine example, it releases or it induces a set of changes in the learning mechanisms of the brain that strongly reinforce whatever kind of behavior one is doing now. So in the case of these rats, I think this was done in the 1950s, the rat will wander around the cage, not really doing much, have some food, it'll pee, whatever, and then it'll go over and maybe explore the lever and accidentally press it, and then it gets a big jolt of reward. It's like, wow, wow, that's I want to do that again. Brilliant. So press it again and press it again and again and again and again. Now there's some kind of pop neuroscience stuff about the way these rats behaved, and they probably didn't keep on pressing over and over until they died, literally. But they did, when given the choice between pressing and food, they would very often choose pressing, and they certainly became extremely addicted to pressing the lever that gave them the little electrical jolt. Now, has this been tried in humans, you may ask? Yeah, it has. Robert Heath tried it. I won't actually go into this in much detail because Anders Sandberg is writing a paper on the history of wireheading. Robert Heath's work is monstrous, but essentially he tried to use this to combine to cure homosexuality, which didn't work very well, and even in a kind of non-normative sense, and was just bad science, really. But he did demonstrate that one could make a patient really want to press a little button that would self-stimulate them. But yeah, Anders Sandberg is writing a paper on this, so I'll have to get him on chat about it, or maybe go through it on stream. Incidentally, do let me know if there are any like papers or topics you'd particularly like to see me cover on stream. Um, so anyway, go back to the brain jacking. If one This region of the brain is sometimes stimulated in modern treatments, mainly for the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder and possibly sort of being researched, but chronic depression, very severe refractory depression, and whether or not those will become common indications uh, for the treatment, we're not sure, but it certainly is used, and it's likely to be a target that future neurostimulation will want to target. Excuse me. And an attacker who demonstrated some level of sophistication could use this reward learning system. Very itchy nose. Um, and I'm talking about cocaine a lot. I swear I haven't been taking any, just bloody pollen and whatnot. Um, Now everyone's going to think I protest too much. Anyway, so this hypothetical attacker, particularly if they have access to constant surveillance over the over the victim, could reinforce behavior when they are engaging in the behavior that the attacker wants them to, and potentially uh, exerting some very limited form of behavioral control over the target. Now, again, I want to emphasize this would be far more work than it's worth for most attackers, and there are, if we're talking about like intelligence agencies, it's going to be easier, 99 times out of 100, to use the classic money ideology, coercion, and ego sort of framework, or there's more modern ones, but I have to talk about espionage at some point because that's all very interesting. But skipping over that, uh, there are existing ways that spies can get you to do things that don't involve uh, hacking into your brain. Nevertheless, I think as a point of sort of technical feasibility, it certainly is plausible, and is something that going forward manufacturers and clinicians I think need to be aware of. So I've kind of already talked about this. This is my wonderful graphic uh, of some of the kind of attack surfaces um, of emerging implants, and so particularly worried about this integration with consumer devices. It just opens it up to a whole bunch of existing flaws. Though conversely, keeping it all uh, you know, small company manufactured devices like this, you're essentially relying on security through obscurity there, because while there are a lot of exploits available for popular platforms, there's also much more being invested into their security. So any exploits that do pop up tend to get closed quicker. And part of the reason why this whole area, the going off into the wild, is so worrying, is because even with my aforementioned Pringle can antenna, you have to be moderately close to your victim if you're trying to connect with a laptop to their implants. You might be able to do it 50 meters away, maybe 100 if you've got some moderately fancy kit, but beyond that, you're just definitely not going to pick up a Bluetooth or one of the other radio communication protocols used by these devices. But once you're on the internet, distance doesn't matter. So we can start getting remote hacks from China or Russia targeting people in the Western Europe or anywhere, um, and that's not ideal. Um, though potentially even more concerning is the fact that manufacturers themselves or governments might want to put backdoors into medical devices. Um, so that's all a bit more speculative and kind of gets more into the like pure cybersecurity stuff that we might have a chat about some point. So so the actual like technical details of making these things secure are maybe a bit much to go into right now in great detail, but essentially there's a lot of potential technical solutions, but none of them is going to be a silver bullet, which is the case with any cybersecurity application. But in terms of implants, we've got some extra limitations that make things additionally challenging. So open versus closed is, as I mentioned, the analogous to the kind of issue of proprietary in-house devices that are obscure and don't have many people targeting them, but if they're cracked open, it's more difficult to secure it, versus open architectures and more widely, like publicly available standards. Um, in terms of the specifics of implantable medical devices, though, particularly neurostimulators. So first of all, you've got the battery. Any additional layer of security that you're going to encounter, that you're going to implement, is almost certain to drain the battery more. And when we're dealing with implants that might have to last for years and years inside a person, we want to maximize the battery life as much as possible. And this is gradually becoming a bit less of a problem. As I was talking about earlier, rechargeable ones are getting somewhat better at this. But we're not just talking about a phone where the battery runs low after 2 or 3 years. Fuck it, buy a new one. We're talking about something that costs orders of magnitude more than your phone. Um, I don't know, some of the newer iPhones maybe only like one order of magnitude more, um, but still, considerably more, and comes with substantial surgical risk from implanting it. There's the practicality. So, like I was talking about earlier, with the kind of boomers managing to access iPads and control their medical devices, there's got to be consideration for the fact that a lot of these patients are older, and I don't mean that. I genuinely don't mean that in a mean sense. It's just that older people and people with cognitive decline, which a lot of these patients do have, and some of them have comorbid dementias, um, and even among those who don't, uh, we've got to design things that are devices that are accessible to I want to use the lowest common denominator, but replace that with something that just doesn't sound like too patronising. I don't know. We've got to design around people who do have cognitive limitations relative to the norm, and whereas with consumer devices, you've got more of a kind of range to choose from, and it's not as they don't tend to be as life critical. From the perspective of kind of distributive justice, we've got to ensure that medical devices are particularly accessible to all, and so we can't start implementing complex password trackers or lots of extra devices that you've got to carry around to authenticate. Enough people get confused with having a little chip and pin thing to do a two-factor security for their bank. If it's a device that is critical for someone to have a pleasant existence, to get value out of their own life, and sometimes people to live, then we can't be gating it behind a whole layer of technological obfuscation. And that kind of goes for clinician access too, because it needs to be this fucking thing. I need to work out why this thing just keeps on turning itself off. I'm not sure whether it's that um, it's not receiving any sound. Maybe if I just play a sound in the back. Anyway, doesn't matter. As I was saying, if I was so rudely interrupted by my technology, uh, devices like this, any implantable medical device, needs to be accessed in an emergency. So if I have, an insulin pump and I fall unconscious and go into hospital, then the clinicians need to be able to access it and turn it off, or check what kind of insulin I'm on, or read the how much has been delivered over the last 2 hours, or any of these numerous functions. That isn't really helped if they've got to type in a long password, and I use long passwords. So if I've got a password on my insulin pump, it's probably going to be quite difficult, or at least if I weren't already aware of this problem. Um, so you've got to have a system that is kind of in some way built it has a backdoor built in. There needs to be a way of clinicians to access the device without necessarily um, without necessarily having uh, access to the patient's medical notes, because it might be that the person's on holiday, or that they've lost their medical notes or whatever. Um, the headphones highlight the daily experience of tech issues and how incomprehensible they can be to users. In this case, minor frustration. Yeah, exactly. And I know from personal experience, like tech issues with my diabetes equipment is extra frustrating, because this shitty little gizmo, again, no offense to Abbott, like you do a good job making the sensors, but this thing is not very user friendly. So when it's a dual function, like implant scanner and blood glucose reader. So I'll show you what it does now. Uh, I take one of these test strips, which actually I've been to the factory where they produce these. It's very cool, and we've got a little bit of glucose oxidase on the end there, and some electrodes on the other end. Plugs into the device, and it automatically starts asking for blood. So the screen lights up and it's asking for blood. Sometimes it just decides not to notice that I've plugged in the test strip, and that's really fucking annoying. Like, more annoying, considerably more annoying than when, my computer wants to reboot itself randomly, or when my headphones switch off even midstream. Because the headphone switching off is a bit stressful. I'm like, oh, fuck, my viewers are getting interrupted. I don't have a huge number of viewers, but I've got enough and very dedicated viewers, I love you all, that I don't want to, have that interrupted. Whereas With this, it's something that I rely on for my health and rely on. So, little prick of the finger, and it sucks up my blood. And then the glucose oxidase reacts with the glucose in the blood to send electrical signal. Anyway, 5.7 millimoles, we're coming back down, okay. So the point of all that is that both to continue talking to you while I do a medically necessary procedure, and to explain that having an extra barrier between you and your health can just be all the extra frustrating, even when it doesn't have any particularly substantial additional like material impact. You know, there's an extra 3 seconds of my doing something to switch my headphones back on, an extra 3 seconds of my doing something to stick in the test strip again. But sticking in the test strip gives me an order of magnitude more, blood pressure raise or cortisol release, or I don't want to make that empirical claim for sure, but I, I'd be willing to bet that it's a statistically significant difference if we run the test enough times. But certainly from my subjective experience, I get a lot more frustrated at that. Um, so we've got to design systems that are friendly to people and friendly not just to techies, but friendly to everyone who might be using them. And when some of those users are kids, are people with cognitive disabilities, are older people, we've got to be very mindful of that. And we can't have seven-factor authentication with, a wrist dongle and two forms of biometrics and blah 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 blah, because that's just not realistic. And it's probably too much of a trade-off. Like I say, this whole issue of neurosecurity and brainjacking is not something that I think that every clinician and every patient should be super freaked out about. It's something that I think is worth thinking about and investigating now, um, and over the next coming years, so that when we get 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever years down the line, and neurotechnology is ubiquitous, we don't have some massive flaws in our kind of conceptual approach to security that lead to things like the cyber brain hacks in Ghost in the Shell. Um, so yeah, I've already covered this a little bit and kind of getting in there. Half of these slides, I do this presentation in different order each time, and then half these slides are just there to remind me that so I haven't skipped over anything. Um, but there are plausible reasons I think why someone might want to attack a patient, um, and Ghost in the Shell obviously shows us that espionage and well, in case Ghost in the Shell, I think it's a free artificial intelligence, and the intersection between artificial intelligence and neurological implants is unfortunately a topic for another evening. Um, though I'll give you a little hint. One of my big motivations for being interested in neurosecurity, in the uh, sort of the integrity of our minds and the at least of our brains. We can debate as to whether brain and mind are separate and whatever, but the integrity of our brains and the data that they contain, I think is exceedingly important, in part because we are heading in a direction where artificial intelligence does become ubiquitous, and whatever form that AI takes, and I don't want to start speculating that it would necessarily be conscious or would necessarily be sentient or anything like that, but whatever form it takes, it's likely to give us increasingly powerful control over our own and potentially over other people's neurological states. And it's possible that we will achieve better safety by integrating our brains more directly with artificial intelligence, as Elon Musk argues with Neuralink, and as more, well, he argues that he's the most prominent person arguing it, but he's basing his arguments off largely off those put out by the Future of Humanity Institute, which, if you haven't guessed yet, I really like their work, and I'm also quite concerned about the possibility. Well, I'm concerned about the possibility of artificial general intelligence causing all kinds of problems. I'm also concerned about the possibility of the intersection between AI and neuroscience, neurological implants causing all kinds of problems. But I'm also somewhat optimistic about the possibility of using neurological implants to, in some way, better integrate ourselves with machines, or more tightly integrate ourselves with machines, so that we have increased control over them. Now, what would that actually look like is a topic that, like I say, I think I will leave for another day, and is something that I'm not even particularly confident about. I don't think anyone's really particularly confident about, which is one of the reasons why I think it's really worth thinking about. Because if if brain-computer interfaces are the solution to the problems posed, or at least some of the problems posed by artificial general intelligence, which maybe, if that is the case, then we want them to be safe and secure and not increase risk radically in other areas. So, so that's kind of that's my long-term reason for being interested in this topic. Obviously, I can give a lot of shorter-term reasons that I think are valid and worthwhile. And honestly, if I'm giving this presentation to most people, I'll typically, just stop at the kind of medium-term reasons. But I think it's definitely worth considering the integration of our brains with machines, what consequences that's going to have, and how we can mitigate the risk of the worst outcomes while maximizing the probability of the best outcomes. Because, as I showed towards the start, what these implants can do is absolutely wonderful. And they're so simple at the moment, but in terms of, compared to the brain and compared to other consumer electronics, they are just Stone Age, um, Bronze Age. Um, but they can still do so much good, and they are rapidly increasing in complexity at the moment. Like I say, they've gone from being extremely simple devices to more complex than the average calculators. Now they're becoming proper uh, uh, advanced IoT, like embedded systems, and not hyper advanced, but still they're increasing in complexity, which opens up huge new vistas of what we can do just in medicine, and potentially what we can do in terms of enhancement. I just really don't want to see that opportunity squandered. So, so yeah, that's kind of my um, sorry, these are my normie lessons. These are, and I don't want to understate, these are all important. Like, we need more cooperation from the regulators, from manufacturers. We need better guidance and regulation, both standards and some of the DMCA, and I can't remember the name of the UK one. There are several, like, intellectual property acts that are causing problems for research into these kind of areas, because reverse engineering these devices might be illegal in some contexts. And um, greater clinician awareness, particularly of, like, the potential signs of these sort of attacks, because if these attacks do ever take place, we need some way of identifying them And patient awareness, I put a question mark there because I think it's something that might be worth there having some kind of awareness of, but I don't think it's necessarily the right time yet because I don't want to go out like scaring patients, particularly as there's not a huge amount they can do, and the probability of this ever occurring to them with modern implants seems to be very low. This is, to reiterate for the 20th time, this is a risk that I think is worth considering for the future, but not one we need to be running around today and losing our heads about. Nevertheless, um, I do very much think it's worth considering, and hopefully, uh, yeah, these are some of the areas actually I wrote this a few years ago, so it'll be interesting to quickly go through. So cybersecurity, penetration testing, probably not as useful as I originally thought. Not least because the architecture on these things does change a fair bit generation to generation, and my main concern is more in the future. So it's a cool thing that researchers can do, but threat modeling is worth doing, but I wouldn't do it as much in public these days, I think, for the aforementioned information hazard reasons. Countermeasure design, very useful, very much worth considering outside of my main area of expertise, at least in terms of electronic countermeasures, but I think maybe one of the most valuable areas. The ethics stuff, I have co-authored a paper with Dr. Jonathan Pugh and Anders Sandberg and Julian Savulescu and Tipu Aziz on the impacts of brainjacking on personal autonomy, and I'll go through that at some point, or maybe get one or two of the others on to chat about it because I think that's interesting. Also, self-hacking, something I haven't talked about here, and I very much want to distinguish from brainjacking, is the idea of hacking one's own implants for the purposes of improving treatment or modulating mood or any of the others. So, for example, my glucose monitor is has been hacked by this aftermarket device and open source software running on my phone that was not produced nor distributed by Abbott Diabetes Care. Nonetheless, it vastly improves my standard of care. I don't think it's at all implausible that people with neurological devices may wish to uh, alter their own. Indeed, a few have, but on a more widespread basis, may want to alter their own cognition in certain ways, and without taking too strong a stance, without without taking too strong a stance, um, I think that that's broadly a good thing and broadly something we should be supportive of, though with some fairly substantial caveats. And there's some areas of law that I think this applies to. It's way outside of my field, but interesting. I've had a chat with a couple of law scholars about this, and education on the topic of uh, the of clinician education. Getting them kind of aware of these risks. So yeah, like I say, I figured I'd kind of run through that, partially because it's a relatively easy thing for me to talk about, and I've been a little bit under the weather today. But also, um, it's been a while of doing these streams, and I think I've earned something a little bit self obsessive and masturbatory to talk about, some of my own work. Um, so also to emphasize, I don't want to give the impression that this work is that I consider it to be as important as most of the other topics I talk about. It's certainly not. It's the kind of thing that we should have, some engineers in relevant companies and maybe a few more grad students, and maybe someone wants to hire me as a fellow doing it or something. But it's not something that we should be putting, you know, billions of dollars into funding. Whereas most of the topics that I've talked about so far, maybe with the substantial exception of cocktail history, are things that I think we should be putting many billions of dollars into. Um, that said, anybody want to like fund my work? Drop me a line. Um, but yeah, it's mainly just a topic I'm quite interested in. So yeah, I'm gonna wrap up there. I hope people have found that somewhat intriguing. That's the kind of normally I do a tight half hour on that with sometimes 20 minutes with like 10 for questions, but I figured I could luxuriate a little bit and give the kind of uh, director's cut version. Also, show you some Ghost in the Shell. So yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see you. What have we got? Oh yes, Wednesday. Wednesday, I am having Neon Golden, my beautiful and wonderful fiance, on to talk about essentially we're going to be together giving a guide on how to read a scientific paper as a non-specialist. Um, so it's something I've been noticing as I've been like watching more Twitch and stuff. I've been noticing a lot of people, and I don't want to like be mean or anything, but a lot of people don't have a fucking clue of how to read a scientific paper, and I'll see people kind of going through and like reading sentences that aren't really relevant to the key message, and like uh, that's for next session from Wednesday. I will, with help of my fiance, uh, who has her doctorate. She's an actual doctor. I'm not, not yet at least. But we will go through and talk about some of the like easy pitfalls and methods for researching um, papers, particularly if it's an area you don't know about, and some kind of tips and tricks for like how to read papers a bit faster and uh, yeah, like things that normies do that I think detract from the discourse, or things that you could be doing more. Not to say that you're all normies on this channel, but things that people could be doing more to improve the situation. So yeah, any questions, tweet us at Laurie Pycroft, or I think have you just got Amy Gillespie? I forget, or is it Amy Gillespie 27? Put your put your Twitter and um, but yeah, Amy is sorry, Dr. Gillespie is a expert in psychiatric genetics, currently doing research into treatment-resistant depression. She's got a lot of experience with systematic reviews, and Dr. Amy Gillespie. There you go. That's the Twitter. Um, I've changed it recently, so it's not like I completely don't know my own fiance's Twitter handle. Uh, but yeah, uh, message her or me, and we'll try to answer any questions you might have about how to read papers, and just like it's obviously not going to be as in depth as a whole degree in a specific scientific subject, but hopefully it should give you some good ideas for how to approach the literature, because I think there's a hell of a lot of value in the fact that science in many ways has been democratized over the last like 20, 30 years. uh, it's far, far easier than ever for people to get access to proper first-hand sources, deep scientific evidence, and indeed we'll show you a few tricks for getting access to journals. Don't tell the Twitch copyright people. Uh, but it's easier than ever to get access to this material, but you need to have a basic understanding of how to read it and contextualize it in order for it not to send you completely in the wrong direction. Um, and honestly, a lot of that is stuff that you can learn in an hour or two of listening to a couple of people talk on Twitch. So yeah, come along, give it a listen, and it should be good. Friday, I'm not sure what drink I'm doing yet, but I do have a post-normal Facebook group. Follow that. I will probably post the drink ahead of time if anybody wants to make along with me. And next week, I I think Monday next week I've got Dan Pryor of the Adam Smith Institute coming on to discuss drug policy, which should be very interesting. So I'll post all this stuff in the future. But yeah, thank you for watching, everyone. I do appreciate your time, and I hope you found it interesting, and I hope you have a pleasant evening, and tune in. Oh, like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. But yeah, hope you have a pleasant evening, and yeah, see you on, or at least see myself in my screen reflection on Wednesday.